There we go. Now it's official. Welcome everyone to this evening's Buy the Book virtual event in collaboration with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore here in Chicago. We are delighted to have Christa Noel Robbins and Kris Cohen here as tonight's speakers. We are celebrating Krista's beautiful new book, Artist as Author. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers tonight. We'll turn it over to them to have a conversation, and then at the end we'll have some Q&A time. So if any questions come to you throughout the event, feel free to pop them in the chat to everyone, and we'll either read them out or call on you if you want to speak to those questions later on. Okay, so I am Adrienne Myers from the University of Chicago Press, where I have the delight to work with Christa and some of our other art books. Our first speaker tonight, the author Christa Noel Robbins, is an associate professor of art history at the University of Virginia. Her essays and reviews have been published in a variety of outlets, including Art in America, Oxford Art Journal, Art History, and the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And she was the advisory editor of North American Modernism for the Routledge Encyclopedia of Modernism. Kris Cohen is associate professor of art and humanities at Reed College. He works on the relationship between art, economy, and media technology, focusing especially on the aesthetics of collective life. His first book, Never Alone Except for Now, addresses these concerns in the context of electronic networks. His current research explores the way that Black artists working in the wake of the Black arts movement experimented with a set of emerging computational technologies. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. Keep an eye on the chat for a link to purchase Krista's book from the Seminary Co-op. And all right, Kris and Christa, y'all can take it away.
All right, thanks, Adrienne. Well, first of all, Christa, congratulations. So exciting to be holding this book, and really excited to have been asked to help with the event. Christa is the person who has read every single one of my wretched sentences that I've ever written in draft before they reach anyone else. And so I don't know if I'm returning the favor or something, but it feels good. I'm really excited about this book. It's an amazing book. So I don't know, I told Christa that as a gift that I would try to do the work of summarizing the book so that she wouldn't have to. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'll see if she wants to modify anything I said or add anything I said, and then go through some questions from there. Did you want to add anything to start, Kristen?
No, I'd love for you to initiate everything,
Okay.
and thank you for that, Kris.
So I'm going to read a tiny, like one sentence from the introduction, and then try to play out what the scope of the project is in a few minutes. So Christa says, but attending more carefully to the concerns Tworkov voiced, which orbit around questions of intention, effect, and temporality, also reveals something held in common across that scene, the scene of modernist art practice. A concern with the question of authorship, and a commitment to investigating its significance in and as practice. Looked at with more care, the differences we are quick to see between neo-avant-garde and modernist practice are less ideological than technical. That is to say, such differences are best located in the means by which questions such as authorship arise, rather than in the questions themselves. This book makes this clear by looking carefully at modernist painters working in the 1950s and 1960s. In addition to Tworkov, a careful consideration of Archie Gorky, Helen Frankenthaler, Kenneth Nolan, Sam Gilliam, and Agnes Martin demonstrates that modernist painters, like their neo-avant-garde contemporaries, were involved in a critical inquiry into the question of the artist as author. So that supposed distinction, what's usually drawn as a pretty hard distinction between what Christa calls here the neo-avant-garde and modernist art practice, is really a sort of not the crux of the book, but the thing that the book works really hard to undo as a distinction, right? It's another way to put it is that is the relation between expressionism and abstraction, or gestural painting in minimalism, or really any of the practices that follow in the wake of minimalism and in the wake of the 50s and 60s that get articulated as performance art or installation art that often get thought of in opposition to modernist art practice as a kind of practices that are either not about the self or that are against the idea of the self. So the distinction is usually drawn, and this is really where Christa intervenes, I think, in an important way, between arts practices that express or aggrandize, that occupy the self in some way and communicate it outward through the work, and a set of practices that seem to come in the wake of those as though oppositional, that seem to dissolve the self, to negate the self, to be not interested or indifferent to the self, to just seemingly to have given it up. The terms of that debate, as Christa gives it to us, are sort of set by the publication of Roland Barthes' Death of the Author essay in 1967 in a special issue of Applin on minimalism and minimalist practice. So that essay has sort of become the voice of neo-avant-garde practice, the kind of clarion call for artists working in the wake of what in retrospect seems to be sort of practices of the self, right? Expressionist or gestural practices of painting. And it's really, I think, the book's interest in the role that essay has played that is why it's called Artist as Author, rather than this being a structuralist or semiotic book. In fact, I think in many ways the book is anti-structuralist and anti-semiotic. So it's really about playing out the terms by which authorship was posed as a kind of opposition to artistry at that moment. And I think, so as in the start of Chris's move to sort of sidestep that debate, but really ends up looking like reading it more carefully by the end. You say that you don't want this book to be a book where context explains the works, historical context. And that's really important too, because this is a historical period where historical context tends to do a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to sort of organizing the works of a period, whether that's post-war, whether that's the Cold War, whether that's sort of discourses of American exceptionalism in the context of the Cold War and the way that art practices were enlisted to those efforts, right? The historical context is heavy in this period. So you start off by saying you don't want context to do the work, explaining the work. And instead that you want to, what you say is grant agency to artists as conscious agents. So then it becomes really important what the difference is between conscious agents and expressionistic selves, or on the other hand, decentered selves, right? What does Christa mean by that? And I think one of the things that feels really important to me is that we learn over the course of the book to hear that idea of artists as conscious agents as a pretty humble and even sort of minor claim about agency. So in other words, it's not what's being voiced here isn't a kind of a full-throated reclaiming of some kind of agency, as though the problem being confronted is artists have lost their voice. That was never really the problem. I think it's more the question of what opens up to us when we exit the terms of that debate between a kind of strong self and an equally strong gesture to give up the self, right? What happens if those two gestures don't organize the field of modernist art practice anymore? And one of the things that's so interesting that ends up happening is that all sorts of actions that don't actually feel or look like agency start to show up as important practices. And that means everything, and the ones that stand out to me are Agnes Martin's practice of sort of just filling time in the art act of making a painting, to the critic Harold Rosenberg's idea or his calling of painting at one point, a record of unfreedoms, or a record of unfreedom, right? Those things maybe don't stand out to us as sort of strong forms of agency, but I think those are the things that come into view once we sort of give up on this toggle or this opposition between the strong self and the equally strong gesture of seeming to give up on the self. And well, so I'll leave it at that for now. I think so. Then the chapters unfold really as an attempt to explore the small, sometimes ephemeral, sometimes nakedly experimental actions that happen in the wake of sort of attending to these paintings, this practices in the 1950s and 60s, outside the terms of that debate, but really position two strong forms of the self in opposition. What happens when we attune ourselves to far more minor, small, insignificant, lateral forms of agency that look like that get played out in, and as you say, as the works of art. Is there anything you'd add to that or correct in that at this point?
No, so far I like it. I love that you say that it's a humble claim about agency, because it's true that you could read this book as this reclamation of the self, the recentering of the self, the reclamation of expressionism, etc. And that was not my desire. My desire was to demonstrate the complexity of these questions for the artists themselves. And it also was not necessarily to give artists a voice as it was to give the paintings a voice, to actually look at the paintings. How are the paintings themselves interceding in this debate? How are they complicating the debate? How are they themselves making claims within that debate? But then even the artists who make them have to reconcile themselves with. And I think that one of the things that gets glossed over in this binary that you're narrating really is the paintings. And I've always been interested in paintings.
Right. And, I think one of the things that happens that's interesting as an effect of that move in terms of thinking about the artist as a conscious agent is that, biography actually doesn't come to dominate the readings or even really play that privileged of a role. I mean, you're attentive to biography and you're really attentive to archives in each of the chapters. But the paintings are always what end up being sort of providing if anything provides a key for reading something else, the paintings provide a key for reading the biography and not the other way around. So it ends up being, and I think that's one of the effects too of opening up the sort of aperture for what we can pay attention to well beyond sort of strong forms of self-expression or their abnegation, is that their biography and the artist are no longer sort of they're not the same, right? They don't overlap perfectly anymore. And the paintings in some ways look like a place for people to play out kind of conflicts that they might even have with their own biography as they've lived it to that point. So like someone like Helen Frankenthaler, I think would be a good example of that.
Gorky, who's literally trying on different personas in his paintings. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think I'll just make one more point of that. Then maybe we'll turn to maybe look at a Frankenthaler for a second. But I think one of the things that I really appreciate about that move is that the terms of that debate, as you sort of sketch it in the beginning and as you see them having played out after in the wake of Roland Barthes' essay, have always struck me as in some ways pretty trapped within a kind of racial whiteness, in the sense that both forms of what seem like an opposition are both really strong forms of selfhood, right? The idea of expressing the self as though the self is simply there as a resource to be drawn on, or the idea of negating the self as though it's just so much skin or paint to sort of shed at will, are both they both presume that the actor in that situation can sort of just slough off history when and as they want. And I feel like instead what you give us are, careful chapters that very carefully trace the various kinds of sort of frictions and variances in the way these artists experience, themselves through the practice of painting, and the way that varies from artist to artist. So it actually gives you really different and new ways to pay attention to things, for instance, like identity, for instance, gender in the Frankenthaler chapter, or race in the Gilliam chapter.
Yeah, and in particular, modernist paintings. I wouldn't say ever painting generically here, that these are all actors who have positioned themselves really consciously in relation to this thing called modernist painting. And so it would look really different if you were to expand the field beyond that. And so while I do always grant the painting a kind of voice above biography and historical context, that's always curtailed and framed by this proximity to the discourse of modernism, which each of these painters is hyper aware of. And so it's not just painting in general, but modernist painting that allows this articulation in the literal sense of articulation, that it's a form that is being presented in front of another form, or it's being articulated in relation to something else. It's against that background of modernism, as it's being articulated by dominant voices like Harold Rosenberg and Thomas Hess and Clement Greenberg, that identity or authorship can be explored and expressed, but articulated.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about that because there's another way of talking about this book that would say that in some ways it's a book that's really interested in questions of belonging, right? The idea of the artist very consciously attempting to belong to the what you usually call the modernist field is a really big part of every chapter. And I think it's not the case that any artist sort of successfully, seamlessly ends up just belonging, but that the chapters are really about how important that is to each of the artists, and then the sort of the struggle or to sort of wrestle with what the terms of that are, and that paintings end up looking like a kind of a record of that struggle to belong. And I was struck by that because it like that's in sort of more polemical forms of talking about modernist art practice. Usually in the place of where you talk about belonging, you get a conversation that was sort of about like autonomy versus co-optation or something like that. Like artists having accepted the terms by which their art is judged and having become successful and therefore giving up their autonomy. Like there's that kind of, that fantasy of escape and recapture that sort of over-organizes so much of the writing about these artists. So I don't know, can you talk a little bit about why these chapters ended up being organized around the term of belonging for you?
Yeah, I mean, think about, first of all, the way in which it switches the stakes of the conversation, and how if one is thinking about both painting and artists seeking belonging, then you're looking at strategies and practices of demonstrating that belonging or negotiating that belonging. And so for me, Kenneth Noland is the person who is a model of submission to belonging, and I think a kind of beautiful but also like weirdly compromised manner. And I do like thinking of his giving into the rhetoric, especially of Michael Fried, as a kind of release into a disciplinarity that maybe shouldn't be cast as purely negative, since he was dealing in theories of a kind of a release that were positive. But then you see somebody like Helen Frankenthaler negotiating that belonging as a troubled relation, and trying to figure out not how to gain autonomy, but how to find her place within it, in the same way that I think Gilliam was doing. So when you think about it as belonging as opposed to asserting autonomy or acquiescing to co-optation, I think what you have to attend to is practice, and how it becomes a practice of belonging. It becomes a manner of exploring and demonstrating what that would mean. And I think Agnes Martin's claim that so many people just completely fly by, that she is a quote unquote abstract expressionist, is a strong assertion of belonging. To think about, well, how are her paintings negotiating or demonstrating through practice that sense of belonging? I mean, it really, it doesn't just shift how we see her works, it shifts how we see that field and how she understood it. So yeah, for me, it was just a much more productive way of thinking about that field as not necessarily a top-down field, but or a kind of disciplinary or doctrinaire discourse or practice that you had to give into, but rather a sort of various options and opportunities to differently find a practical relationship to this thing that was called modernist painting, which was never settled. I mean, I know people like Michael Fried think it's a totally settled notion of what that is and what its identity is, but for the people practicing it was never settled. It was always a claim to the modern that they were staking in each of their works.
Right. And because you don't articulate or understand belonging as something that one either succeeds in or fails at, and you don't articulate it as sort of a, a set of norms that are imposed upon a field necessarily, then it's always kind of a practical negotiation. And what that, I think, allows, that's hard to find in discussions of these painters is, the sense of what their attempts at belonging to that field do to the field itself, right? The kind of the subtle and weird ways that the membership, never fully achieved of each of these artists into the modernist field sort of warps the field in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, because some painters obviously impact that field more than others. I mean, people acknowledge without fully embracing the way in which Frankenthaler shaped that field without being acknowledged as doing so. But at the end of the day, we all know what's really shaping the field. It's art critics and commercial galleries and curators. So the notion of not necessarily looking at achievements or failures is a part of seeing what it was like to live within that field and either experience moments of belonging or not. And belonging can be burdensome. Belonging can be something you want to throw off.
Right. Yeah, it's clear that it gets lived as a desire, but also, right, sometimes a kind of a burden or a constraint, and gets worked out that way in the practice. Where did the project start for you?
A really long time ago.
I know you don't have to. I mean, all books are long processes, but I didn't say when. I said what.
So you're invited. Yeah. So it really began thinking about this crux that you began describing that gets repeated over and over again in art historical narratives about how there was this period, especially in American art, where artists were naively attached to this incredibly unreflective notion of the self. And then all of a sudden people are come into some kind of consciousness in the late 60s of the fact that, well, the self is a more complicated thing, and structuralism, etc. And that just seems like a really stupid narrative to me. And I always knew that it couldn't be the case that artists were, in fact, thinking so naively. And in part, because of my research into Harold Rosenberg, who is an icon of this naive notion of the self, I knew that, just empirically it wasn't the case. And so, moved amongst the documents and paintings that are loosely associated with expressionism in a kind of troubled manner, because there's a lot of those paintings, and it's hard to figure your way through it. But I have to say, through Thomas Hess and through Rosenberg, I was able to get a foothold in those early conversations about quote unquote originality and expressionism and all these key words that we associate with this period, and then to track its evolution into another break, which is within modernist painting itself, where it said that painters aligned with Greenberg understood that expressionism had become this kind of corrupting value within modernist painting, and so you shift into what Greenberg called post-painterly abstraction. Like, all of these little narratives seemed very neat to me, and because of my abiding interest in paintings and in artists, I started looking carefully and looking again. So the whole book begins, in the 40s with a conversation amongst painters and critics, but really I think it begins with Noland and just the weirdness of his paintings. There's so much rhetoric around him. He becomes this poster boy for modernist painting. And when you look at his paintings, there's like nothing, there's literally nothing there to talk about. And that for some reason became intriguing to me. Not just how a very sparse painting could generate so much discourse, but also what it would be like to live with those sparse paintings and make them over and over and over again until you die, in the 2000s. So
you want to, should someone show the Noland you have queued up?
Sure. So do you see it?
Yeah.
So this was, I said to Kris in an email or a text, I think today or yesterday, like Turnsole was the turning for me. It was a painting I went back to again and again and again. It is, to my eyes, a beautiful painting, and I know that very few people can see that. And that in itself became an interest to me. Like, how do you get into the orbit of this painting? I was teaching this painting and paintings like it, I think last week, and one of my classes, and I elicited some kind of like response from my students, and one kid just went like this, just went no, because really, what is there to respond to? I mean, you've stripped it of so much, and for Fried and Greenberg, what you're stripping it of is this, what Greenberg called the affliction of expressionism, but it's, as the book says, it's more complicated than that. And through my research, I began to discover all these interesting attachments that Nolan had to psychotherapy, especially to Wilhelm Reich. And I was able to think about, well, what does it feel like to negotiate that? Literally having Greenberg and Fried standing in your studio telling you what to paint. Like, that's not a metaphor. They're standing there and saying, yes, that one, no, that one. How do you negotiate that as an agent in that field? And then that allowed me to go both backward and forward and think more precisely, how are artists entering into this debate that we attribute to critics and even theorists, but are also being worked through in practice? Does that answer your question?
Totally, yeah. So one of your claims would be that this Nolan has far more in common with the Frankenthaler that you have queued up. You want to show that? So we're here. Then far more in common with the Frankenthaler than maybe has been noticed or people have cared about, right?
Yeah, I don't know in common, but it's said by several art historians like Caroline Jones and Lisa Saltzman that the story is told over and over again about how Helen Frankenthaler paints a painting called Mountain and Sea, which some of you may be familiar with, which is a really large painting which is one of the first paintings that really puts diluted oil onto an unprimed canvas so that it soaks into the canvas. And according to the narrative, this is the moment, when you turn from expressionism to some kind of post-expressionist moment, post-expressionist period of time. And because Frankenthaler is dating Clement Greenberg at the time, she has him come into her studio to look at it, to say, to do the thing that he did, to say like, yeah, go that way, or no, don't go that way. And he said, yeah, don't touch it. That's a good place to go. And the notoriety of the painting is that Greenberg then brings these two very young painters from Washington, D.C., Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan, up to New York to see this painting. And from there, they go back to D.C. and they start experimenting with this new technique. And then it's attributed to their experiments, this new phase of painting. And so there are a lot of, especially feminist historians, who read a lot into that moment. I think there is a lot to read into it. But really what one reads into it often is that after seeing the experiments that Nolan and Lewis went into, Frankenthaler felt a need to curtail her own expressiveness, even though she was still staining, to curtail both the representation of femininity and also any kind of emotive content. And if you look at the body of her work, it just isn't true. I mean, she's constantly attached to the gesture. And even more than that, so that people have really talk about it, she's really interested in representational content and the ways in which paintings in complex manners can come to signify. And I talk a lot about her studying with Kenneth Burke at Bennington and the ways in which various kinds of techniques begin to indicate modes of signification in poetry. She really adapts that, I think, to painting. So yeah, I wouldn't say that she's a lot in common with Nolan, but that Nolan learns just one little thing from her that might be this technique. But another thing about it that he seems to learn, I argue, is that he's able in some manner to think about how you manage how a painting signifies, which she seemed really concerned with, according to me, to manage the entry of an author into that space and how that authorship is signified to an audience. It seems clearer in the Nolan because it's just like, well, where's the author here? I mean, you know, it's a serial painting. It's there's no brushwork. He's reduced everything out of it. Whereas when you look at Frankenthaler, if you don't attend to it in a really careful manner and read it in the manner I think that her paintings invite, it can just seem like she never got it, right? She never got the lesson that Greenberg wanted her to learn from this day. And it's true she never followed that line, and because I think she was more intelligent than the people that Fried ends up saying are really the true heirs of modernist painting, especially when thinking about people like Jules Odlitsky. I mean, come on. She's much too smart to just think, oh, you're just gonna like reduce expression to like a minimal statement and be done with it, right? So paintings like this I think are just very complex interventions into how a painting comes to mean. And it relies on and is in dialogue with people who read paintings very carefully. And so, yeah. So I read it.
You said, yeah. You said to me before, earlier today, that Frankenthaler was the easiest artist, the easiest paintings to write about, I think, right?
Chapter to write.
But the easiest chapter, right? Not the easiest paintings. Okay.
No, an easy chapter because first of all, so many people have just neglected this part of her work, that she was really engrossed in this notion of the rhetoric of motives and how, which is Kent Burke's book, and how various works of art through traditions signify authorship. I mean, I read her explications of that text, which are detailed and long and involved. And it's just really clear that that was something that she was hyper concerned with. And people read her instead as in relationship merely to her femininity, which certainly is a part of it, part of the social text of it, as Anne Wagner would say, or in relationship to her retaining a kind of lyricism that people like Lewis and Morris, or not maybe Lewis, but at least Noland, remove from their work. But there's something much more rhetorical happening here. She's interested in rhetoric, and she has faith in the fact that paintings can make rhetorical interventions into a discursive field. And people seem to be totally unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that in her paintings, which I think is astonishing.
Right, and I think part of her intelligence, as you called it before, would be to say that, to understand that you know, the self is not so easily just given up on, right? Or you don't just cease articulating or expressing or, you know, sort of being available as a self in the world just because you decide one day on a technique, right?
Yeah, but also even
living with oneself and all the traits attributed to you.
Mm-hmm. But even more complexity than that she understands the self to always be mediated through history and tradition, that there are already established traditions for signaling selfhood in paintings, as there is in poetry or literature, and she's playing within those signals. People think she's doing it, I think, unknowingly, for reasons I can't begin to imagine. I can't actually begin to imagine what those reasons are. I'm sure they have to do with their gender. I mean, I just read the most recent thing that's out on Frankenthaler today, and it does the same thing. It calls her Helen throughout. It reduces her paintings to her biography, and it's done with it.
Yeah. You say one of the ways you have of talking about the art, sort of articulating, you think about the relation between self and painting, is that it's on page 100, but what you say, the self is seen as not as expressive or representational, but relational. And that felt like a really important reframing as well, neither expressive nor representational, but relational. I'm going to say quickly what the language of relation does that expressivity and representation don't do for you.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the book, I talk about positions that people take. And so positions are always going to be relational. And so, for example, Frankenthaler's gender is going to be, I mean, which was a part of a public text. I'm not talking about just her experience of like something essentially female in the world, but she was consistently framed in relation to Greenberg, who she had a relationship with. She was consistently framed as somebody who had some kind of, you know, whose femininity allowed her a kind of lyricism relationship to nature, in the same way that, whoops, I tried to go, sorry. In the same way that Gilliam is going to experience his relationship to the modernist field, you know, according to his own particular identity. And the same thing with Nolan, that again, with Nolan having Greenberg and Fried in his studio as he's painting, these are all relations. And I say it in several places in the book, but I want those relations to be taken seriously and to be thought of as relationships, like not just sort of generic identifiers of a person's place according to their gender, class, or race, but the way in which they're actually interacting with the movers and shakers in this field. I mean, again, this isn't painting in general, it's modernist painting, and it's something that's highly controlled at this moment in history. You really have people who are determining who gets into what gallery and sort of setting up flows of networks of belonging, or whatever you want to call it. And so it's in that, when I'm saying relational, I'm not doing some sort of post-structuralist thing. I'm thinking quite concretely about how one positions themselves in this larger social network that is modernist painting.
Right. And one of the implications, I think, is that as important as this period is for articulating a politics of representation, moving it forward, thinking about it in really concrete terms, that politics isn't actually fully adequate to sort of describing the experience of any one of these painters. That what they could be doing is certainly said, you can say they're acting in fields of representation. Gilliam shows up that way all the time, and really, is really forced to show up in as a Black artist in a particular way all the time. But that to really get at something about how the practice negotiates with those demands, that's where the shift to the relational, I think, really adds kind of a entirely different vocabulary to the way we think about how those paintings act in the world and what relationship they have to Gilliam.
Yeah.
For instance.
I mean, for Gilliam, that the need for curators and critics to always relate him to being a Black artist was always, he experiences it and he articulates it in many places, and to me as a limit, as a way in which his paintings are curtailed in the world, and yet it's not something he ever just bypasses. And I love that interview on BET TV that with his soon-to-be former wife, Dorothy Gilliam, where they're just like kind of going at it. She really wants him to articulate, like, how are these a demonstration of the African-American experience? And he won't go there. And they almost start quibbling like on TV about it. And it shows, that it's obviously, he says there's no way it'll never not be a painting by a Black man, but there has to be some way in which we begin to talk about them as something else. And so,
Right.
Talk about negotiation, he's always negotiating that relation.
Right. And so race doesn't drop out of the picture, but race ends up being
Never.
something.
I mean, we're looking at a painting called Red April, which is a reference to the assassination of Martin Luther King in April 1968, right? So yeah. However, there are people who read his paintings in relationship, say, to like batik dyeing and African textiles, which he will always say makes no sense to him because it was never a part of his purview. And what people really failed to talk about a lot in Gilliam is how obsessed he was with what was happening in New York and DC in the 60s around modernist painting.
Right. Yeah. There's I'd say a very similar thing about Alma Thomas too, right? Really important to her to be seen as acting in that field, but sort of on her terms, right?
Yeah, I think on her terms, on people's own terms is a good way to think about it. And that requires giving some respect to the paintings themselves and to think about how they are demonstrations of a negotiation, as you called it, or their practical interventions into a field on their own terms. How are we doing with time, Adrian? Are we supposed to be switching to, are we doing?
We're pretty good.
Right
We
about now, I
can
think.
switch over to the Q&A portion anytime in the next few minutes, whenever folks are ready. If anyone has questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. We have a pretty big group tonight, so randomly unmuting might get a little chaotic, but yeah, if you pop your questions in the chat, we can read it out or call on you.
I didn't want to head you off, Kris. I just was getting nervous about time.
No, I knew we were at that point. I'll ask a quick question while people are typing, and then I'll be done with my questions. But as I think we've made clear that these are you're very self-consciously writing about artists about whom a lot has been written, a lot. And I guess I just wonder, as a kind of a practical activity of looking at the works and writing, how you sort of negotiated that the glut of material about those works, and then your need to sort of encounter them in some ways, not anew or something, but I mean, just have a kind of encounter with them that wasn't completely over determined by that literature about them. Like, what did that look like just practically for you?
Well, I mean, there are two answers to that. One is that I was asked when I was first on the job market and was writing about people like Kenneth Nolan, etc. I was asked whether I ever had tried to look at the paintings absent the critical discourse that surrounded them, and that's in particular, a particular response to people like Gorky and de Kooning and Nolan and Morris Lewis, and that had never occurred to me even to try that, because these paintings were birthed within that discourse. They are a part of that discourse. They're interventions to and rejoinders to the various things that were said about them. So I never take apart the works from the words that were produced around them. So that's one part. And the other part is like all the stuff that comes later. And so I think attending carefully to how the works actually move into discourse and are themselves rhetorical claims in response to that discourse was a way for me to get away from what was written, say, in the 1990s or the early 2000s about these paintings, which is a very, is very overdetermined in its approach to the paintings, because it kind of accepts a given narrative about the modernism, the neo avant-garde, etc. My introduction talks about my being kind of coming into consciousness as an art historian in the 90s in relationship to these arguments that talked about the death of the author and the death of painting and all of these things. And so when I started returning to these paintings after grad school and all of this stuff, it was with an attitude of respect and curiosity that wanted to allow them to speak to me over the voices of, say, Douglas Crimp and Hal Foster and Rosalind Krauss. So there are two different ways in which to get past those words that are quite domineering, but becoming less domineering day by day, interestingly enough.
Mm-hmm. Yep. In part because of books like yours. Okay. Are there questions?
Yeah, we have one in. Kris, do you want to read it out, or do you want me to?
I can do it. Charlotte, do you want to speak it, or do you want me to do it?
You can do it if you want. Or
Okay.
so
Go ahead, Charlotte.
okay. Yes, the question is the importance of the struggle for belonging unique to the modernist movement? And if not, how has the struggle changed over time and movements?
That's a really good question. You know, there's always going to be different iterations of belonging. I do think that a lot of art making is about finding belonging. I mean, I think that, you know, you're making art oriented toward an audience. You know, I make things in my house and I don't think of them as art because they're not seeking belonging or identification in relationship to new field. So I wouldn't say it's unique to modernism or modernist art, but just because I'm so immersed in the modernist field, I do think there's something unique to modernism in that respect. I mean, if you think about it, what makes things modernist in the 19th century is the fact that is their unbelonging, the fact that they become segregated from church and state and everything else, and they have to make room for themselves in the world and justify their belonging in a particular sphere. And so I'm very much I very much believe that modernists, the way we distinguish the modernists by thinking about how by identifying works that make a claim to the modern, that one of the things that they're doing is always making that claim differently in relationship to whatever context they're being made in. And that is unique to the modern, given that so much work that comes before it already finds a place in the world when it's being made. And then, you know, after the modern, who knows? I mean, I don't know. I mean, to me, art just wants to kind of belong to capitalism right now. So I don't know. But yeah, I do think that just wanting to be oriented toward a public is a kind of way of seeking belonging. I think that's a really good question because it's interesting to think about belonging as like from a historical perspective and different instances of it, iterations of it. My brother is talking. Yeah, so my brother is saying that the Nolan, it triggers his OCD because of the uneven ways in which the circles are spaced, and that was something he did. He worked intuitively, so he would begin with one circle, and he often used like dinner plates and just common objects to make his concentric circles. And then he would stand back and look at it, and then he would decide on a color next, and he would build them out in this interesting way. And so he was really always seeking an optical impact, which very few people are responsive to, Michael, so congratulations.
Sir Watt, do you want to say your question, or are you like cooking dinner or something? You want me to say it? Okay.
I'm very.
I'm jealous. So Zerat says, "Hi, Christa. I love what you said about paintings being able to make a rhetorical intervention in a discursive field. It's so refreshing to have Burke in this modernist history, and perhaps rather so than Greenberg. The lyrical, of course, has its own powerful history of erasure, being erased and then being rediscovered in this period, much like the rediscovery of selfhood in this period. Might you say a bit more about the iteration of the lyrical in your project?"
Yeah, I mean, the lyric is, as you say, is so much about like this. I mean, it is about speaking about the self, right? I mean, that's what the lyric is. And a lot has been said about Frankenthaler's lyricism, especially in relationship to her gender. And I think that always strikes me as strange because, I mean, and Kris, you know, could have something to say about this as well. I think Morris Louis is an exceedingly lyrical painter, right? Sam Gilliam is an exceedingly lyrical painter, but in a lot of the rhetoric of late modernism, lyricism is banished in a sense. I mean, Greenberg really did call it expressionism, he called it an affliction. And when he says expressionism, I often think he does mean the lyric. So any reference to the self. He's really troubled by, for example, Anne Truitt's sculptures because of the colors and her tendency to embed in her sculptures references to her biography. So there's a lyric there, and And he just can't reconcile the fact that her sculptures look kind of minimalist, but yet are lyric. So the lyric is very much in question at this moment. And I don't think that Lewis or Gilliam are necessarily playing with the lyric, but Frankenthaler is definitely, especially because she's immersed in people like Burke, is thinking about the lyric and its validity and its place at this moment in history. So yeah, I think there's so much more could be said about the lyric at this moment, and you get people talking about in poetry all the time, but very seldomly in painting for some reason.
We have time for one more question if anyone has something. If not, we can all unmute ourselves if we want to and say our hellos and goodbyes and such, but we'll give it just a second. Last call for questions before we bring this to a semi-official end. Okay, I think we're good. Let's thank Kris and Christa for this wonderful event and for their great answers to the questions that we did have. A little round of applause for them. I put the link again in the chat. Support the Seminary Co-op bookstore, get a copy of Christa's beautiful new book. I'm gonna stop the recording so we're all off the hook for being on video, and then feel free to unmute yourself and say hello if you'd like to.